She signed the marriage contract without reading it. That moment, it looked like survival. A broke waitress, marrying a billionaire overnight. Yeah, it sounded like luck. But it wasn't, because that marriage was never about love. It was a deal, trap. And the shocking truth, the man she married, Adrian Wolfe, didn't just want a wife. He wanted control. But wait, here's the part no one saw coming. The quiet waitress he forced into his world was never just a waitress. And what she did next didn't just break his heart. It destroyed his empire. Lila Monroe wasn't the kind of person people noticed. Not because she wasn't beautiful. Not because she wasn't smart. But because she had mastered something most people never learn. How to disappear in plain sight. Every morning, she woke up before the sun. Same small apartment. Same cracked ceiling. Same silence. She'd sit at the edge of her bed for a few seconds, just staring at nothing, as if she was preparing herself. Then she'd stand up, tie her hair back, and become someone else. A waitress. Not just any waitress. The kind that smiled even when she was tired. The kind that remembered your order. The kind that said, "It's okay," even when it wasn't. Because for Lila, life had never really been okay. But she never complained. Not out loud. That was her thing. She kept everything inside. Pain, stress, fear. All of it. And maybe that was her biggest flaw. Because people like that, they don't break loudly. They break quietly. And no one notices until it's too late. The restaurant wasn't anything special. Just one of those places rich people visited when they wanted to feel normal. Soft lights. Expensive silence. Fake smiles. Lila moved through the tables like she belonged there. But she didn't. Not really. Because every time she looked around, she saw a life she could never have. And she had made peace with that. Or at least, she thought she had. Lila, table 7. Her manager's voice snapped her back. She nodded. Controlled. Always calm. But as she picked up the tray, something felt different. She didn't know why. She couldn't explain it. But there are moments in life that feel small, yet change everything. And this was one of them. She walked toward table 7. Slowly, carefully, professional smile. Steady. But the moment she looked up, she froze. Not physically. No one else would notice. But inside, everything stopped. 'Cause sitting right there was Adrian Wolfe. Everyone knew that name. Even if you pretended not to. Billionaire. Cold. Untouchable. The kind of man people whispered about. But never understood. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't talking. He was just sitting there. Watching. Not the room. Not the people. Or. For a second, their eyes met. And something passed between them. Not love. Not attraction. Something else. Something quieter. More dangerous. Recognition. But that didn't make sense. Lila had never met him before. So why did it feel like he already knew her? "Your order, sir." Her voice didn't shake. She was good at that. He didn't respond immediately. Just kept looking at her. Like he was studying something. Or remembering something. Then finally, he spoke. "You've worked here long." Simple question. But the way he said it didn't feel simple. "Yes." Short answer. "If." Always safe. But he didn't look satisfied. And that's when something shifted. Just slightly. Just enough to matter. Because Adrian Wolfe was not used to people giving him less than he asked for. "Sit." He said it calmly. Not loud. Not aggressive. But it wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. Lila blinked. Confused. Waitresses didn't sit with customers. Everyone knew that. But something about his tone made it hard to say no. She hesitated. And that hesitation, that was important. Because it showed one thing. She wasn't afraid of him. Not really. "I'm working," she replied. Polite, but firm. And for the first time, Adrian smiled. Just a little. Like he found something interesting. "Good," he said. I don't like people who forget their role. That should have been the end of it. Just another strange customer. Just another uncomfortable moment. But it wasn't. Because as Lila turned to leave, he said something else. Something quiet. Something that didn't belong in that moment. Everything has a price. She stopped. Not fully. Just enough. Her fingers tightened slightly around the tray. And for a brief second, something flashed across her face. Not fear. Not anger. Something deeper. Something hidden. But then, it was gone. I'm not for sale. She said it softly. And walked away. That should have ended everything. But it didn't. 'Cause behind her, Adrian Wolfe leaned back in his chair, watching her leave. And for the first time in a long time, he looked interested. Not in a deal. Not in a company. Not in power. But in her. And Lila. She didn't look back. Not once. But if she had, she would have seen it. That look in his eyes. The kind of look that doesn't let go. The kind of look that changes lives. Because what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that Adrian Wolfe didn't approach people twice. But she wasn't just anyone. And somewhere deep inside him, a decision had already been made. Quiet one. Dangerous one. The kind that doesn't need words. And Lila, she felt it, even if she didn't understand it yet, that something had started. Something she couldn't control. Something she couldn't stop. But the truth. This wasn't the beginning of their story. It was the beginning of a game. And neither of them knew how far it would go. 'Cause very soon, Lila Monroe would be forced into a world she never asked for. A world of power, control, secrets, and choices that don't come with a way out. And Adrian Wolfe, he was about to make a move that would change both their lives forever. But the most dangerous part, she wouldn't fight it. Not yet. 'Cause sometimes, the strongest revenge doesn't start with resistance. It starts with silence. But everything was about to change. Lila tried to forget him, and at first, it almost worked. The next morning came like every other morning, quiet and predictable, the kind of routine that made life feel manageable. She woke up early, sat on the edge of her bed for a few seconds, staring at the wall like she always did, then got ready for work without thinking too much about anything. That was her system. Don't think too deeply, don't feel too much, just move forward. But something about that day felt different, and she noticed it immediately even though she couldn't explain it. It was subtle, almost invisible, like a shift in the air before a storm. The restaurant looked the same polished tables, the same soft lighting, the same quiet conversations from people who lived lives far away from hers, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had already changed. She tried to ignore it, telling herself she was overthinking, that it was just another day, but deep down a part of her knew better. And then the door opened. She didn't look up immediately, but she felt it, that strange pull of attention that made her glance toward the entrance without meaning to. And the moment her eyes landed there, her stomach tightened. Adrian Wolfe had walked in again. Not by chance, not by coincidence, not the kind of appearance you could dismiss and move on from. This was deliberate. He wasn't alone this time either. 3 men followed him, dressed in sharp suits, the kind of men who carried authority in the way they moved, the kind of men who didn't waste time. But even as they sat down and started talking, it was clear Adrian wasn't really there for them. His focus shifted almost instantly, and just like the night before, his attention locked onto her. That was the moment everything inside her went slightly off balance. "Lila, table 4, her manager said, but there was something different in his tone too, something tight, almost cautious, like he understood exactly who that man was and what it meant for someone like her to be noticed by him. She picked up the tray, steady as always, controlling her expression the way she had trained herself to do over the years, and walked toward the table. Her steps were measured, her posture calm, but her mind was already racing. This wasn't normal. People like Adrian Wolfe didn't return to places like this twice. Not for the food, not for the service, and definitely not for someone like her. When she reached the table, she kept her voice neutral. "What would you like?" she asked, keeping things simple, professional, safe. "Coffee," he said without breaking eye contact. His tone flat, controlled, like everything about him was calculated. She nodded slightly. "Anything else?" she asked, expecting the interaction to end there, expecting to walk away and regain control of whatever this situation was becoming. But it didn't end. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even irritation. It was something colder than that, something sharper, she said quietly, placing the cup in front of him. "And I'm not interested." That was the moment the atmosphere changed completely. One of the men at the table shifted uncomfortably. Another stopped pretending not to listen. 'Cause no one spoke to Adrian Wolf like that. No one refused him so directly. Adrian leaned forward just slightly. Just enough to make the movement noticeable without being aggressive. "You should be careful what you refuse," he said. And even though the words weren't loud, they carried weight. Lila didn't respond immediately. She didn't react the way most people would have. Instead, she held his gaze for a brief second, just long enough to show that she wasn't afraid, and then she said, "I'm not refusing. I'm choosing." That line hit harder than anything else she had said so far. Created a pause, a real pause, not just silence but a shift in control. For the first time, Adrian didn't respond instantly. He watched her, studying her in a way that felt deeper than before, and then slowly, almost subtly, he smiled. "Good," he said. "I like people who think they have a choice." She tried to focus on her work for the rest of the shift, tried to move through the night like nothing had happened, but her mind kept going back to that conversation, to that tone, to the way he looked at her like she wasn't just another person passing through his world. And when her shift finally ended, she felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical work. She got home, dropped her bag on the chair, and sat down on the edge of her bed again, just like she always did, but this time her thoughts wouldn't settle. And then her phone rang. Unknown number. She stared at it for a few seconds, her thumb hovering over the screen, debating whether to answer or ignore it. Something told her it mattered, but another part of her told her to leave it alone. She chose to ignore it. That decision felt small in the moment, almost insignificant, but it wasn't. The phone rang again, and again, and again. Each time, the pressure built slightly, like the call itself was insisting on being answered. Finally, she picked it up. "Hello," she said, her voice steady but cautious. There was silence on the other end at first, and for a brief second, she thought maybe it was a mistake, but then the voice came. Familiar. "You don't answer calls." Her chest tightened instantly. "How did you get my number?" she asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be simple. "That's not important," he said. "What is important is that I don't repeat myself." The words settled heavily, and before she could respond properly, he added, "Tomorrow, 8 p.m. Just one line. An address. No explanation. No question. Just a location." She looked at it, recognizing immediately that it wasn't a place people like her visited. Private. Expensive. Controlled. She should have ignored it. She should have deleted it and moved on with her life. But something about the way everything had unfolded made that impossible. Because deep down, she knew this wasn't random. This was deliberate. And the most unsettling part of all was the realization that Adrian Wolf wasn't asking her to step into his world. He was already pulling her into it. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Her phone stayed beside her, the screen lighting up occasionally as if it was waiting for something, as if the situation itself wasn't finished yet. She turned away from it, closed her eyes, tried to push everything out of her mind, but the feeling stayed. That something had started, something she couldn't control. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the confusion, beneath the tension, something else began to form. Something quieter, something sharper. Because Lila Monroe wasn't just reacting anymore. She was thinking. And that was the moment everything started falling apart. Lila didn't go. At least, that's what she told herself when the clock hit 8 and she was still sitting in her apartment, the lights dim, the room quiet, her phone lying face down beside her. She convinced herself that ignoring him was the right decision, that whatever this was, It would fade if she didn't engage with it, that people like Adrian Wolfe lost interest quickly when they didn't get what they wanted. But deep down, she knew this wasn't that simple. 8 o'clock passed. Then 9. And for a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe it was over. That she had stepped out of whatever game he was trying to play. That she had chosen correctly. And then there was a knock on her door. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was controlled. Precise. The kind of knock that didn't ask for permission, but expected a response. Her body went still instantly, every instinct sharpening at once. No one came to her apartment. No one even knew where she lived well enough to show up unannounced. The knock came again, slightly firmer this time, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice careful, measured. For a second there was nothing. And then the answer came. "You're late." Her heart dropped. She moved slowly toward the door, each step deliberate, her mind racing faster with every second, trying to understand how this was even possible. When she opened the door just slightly, just enough to see outside, he was there. Adrian Wolfe. Standing like he belonged there, like this was expected, like her decision not to come had never really mattered. "You didn't come," he said, his tone calm, his expression unreadable. "You came here," she replied, and even though her voice was steady, there was something underneath it now, something more alert, more aware. He stepped closer, not aggressively, not in a way that would make anyone panic, but in a way that made space feel smaller. "You gave me no choice," he said. That sentence hung between them, and for a brief second, something about it felt almost true, even though it didn't make sense. "I didn't give you anything," she said, holding her ground. He looked at her for a long moment before responding. "Yes," he said quietly. "You did." There was a pause after that, not empty, but full, like something important had just been said without being fully explained. "Why are you here?" she asked finally, choosing to cut through whatever this tension was becoming. Instead of answering immediately, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. It was thick, neatly organized, the kind of file that carried weight just by existing. He handed it to her without a word. "Open it," he said. She hesitated for a second, her instincts telling her this wasn't something she wanted to see, but curiosity pushed past that hesitation, and she took it. The moment she saw the first page, everything inside her went quiet. Name. Full name. Lila Monroe. Cleanly printed. Precise. She flipped the page and her chest tightened. Personal records. History. Details she had never shared with anyone. Another page. Financial information. Another page. Medical records. Her grip on the folder tightened slightly as the realization hit her fully. This wasn't just information. This was everything. "How do you?" she started, but he cut her off before she could finish. "I know everything," he said. His voice calm, almost casual, like what he was saying wasn't overwhelming at all. "That's what I do." She looked up at him, her expression no longer neutral, no longer controlled in the same way. This wasn't normal. This wasn't something she could brush off or ignore. This was power, direct and undeniable. "What do you want?" she asked, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice. He stepped closer again, just enough to make the space between them feel intentional. "Marriage," he said. For a second she thought she misheard him. The word didn't fit the situation, didn't fit the tone, didn't fit anything about what was happening. "You're joking," she said, letting out a short, disbelieving laugh. "I don't joke," he replied, and the seriousness in his voice made the air shift instantly. This wasn't a suggestion. This wasn't a conversation. This was a decision he had already made. "This is insane," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew he didn't see it that way. "No," he said. "It's necessary." The word necessary landed differently. It raised a question without answering it. Necessary for what? Necessary for who? "For you," she asked. "For both of us," he replied. And that was the moment things started to make even less sense. But then he said something else. Something that changed everything. "Your mother's hospital bills. her breath caught instantly. "Are overdue," he continued, his tone still calm, still controlled. "And the next treatment won't happen without payment." Her hands went cold, the folder slipping slightly in her grip as the weight of his words settled in. That was information no one had. That was something she had kept hidden, something she had been dealing with quietly, alone. "How do you know that?" she asked, her voice lower now. "I told you," he said. "I know everything." And in that moment the truth became clear. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. This was planned. Carefully. Precisely. "You set this up," she said slowly, her mind connecting the pieces one by one. He didn't deny it. He didn't even hesitate. "I created an opportunity," he said. No apology. No explanation. Just control. "What happens if I say no?" she asked, even though a part of her already knew the answer. He looked at her steadily. "You won't." That confidence hit harder than anything else. Not because it was arrogant, but because it was accurate. Because he understood the situation better than she wanted him to. Her eyes dropped back to the folder, to the pages that held her life in someone else's hands, and for a moment she felt the weight of it fully. The pressure, the lack of options, the reality of what this decision meant. But then something shifted. Subtle, almost invisible. She smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It wasn't obvious. But it was there. And Adrian noticed it immediately. Because it didn't look like defeat. It didn't look like fear. It looked like something else. Something controlled. Something intentional. "You're right," she said quietly. That was the moment everything locked into place. But what Adrian Wolfe didn't see, what he couldn't see, was that Lila Monroe had just made a decision too. Not out of pressure. Not out of fear. But out of strategy. Because the most dangerous move in any game is the one that looks like surrender. And as she looked up at him again, her eyes calm, steady, unreadable, the dynamic between them shifted in a way that hadn't happened before. Because this was no longer just his game. And that wasn't even the worst part. The wedding happened so fast it almost didn't feel real. One moment Lila was standing in a quiet room with documents in her hand, and the next, she was signing her name into a life she didn't choose, at least not on the surface. There were no flowers, no music, no family, no celebration, just a polished table, a few silent witnesses, and a contract that looked more like a business merger than a marriage. The air felt controlled, like everything had already been decided long before she walked in. Adrian Wolfe stood across from her, calm as always, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed, like this was just another successful deal closing exactly the way he intended. "Sign," he said. His voice quiet but firm, not forceful but final, the kind of tone that didn't leave room for hesitation. Lila looked at the document one last time, her eyes moving across the clauses, the conditions, the structured language that defined what this marriage truly was. Public appearances, behavioral expectations, confidentiality agreements, financial arrangements. It was all there, clear and controlled. This wasn't love. This wasn't partnership. This was positioning. She understood that. More than he realized. And that was the part Adrian didn't see. Because when she picked up the pen, her hand didn't shake. There was no hesitation, no visible fear, no emotional reaction that would suggest she was stepping into something overwhelming. She signed her name smoothly, almost effortlessly, and in that moment the shift was official. Lila Monroe became Lila Wolfe. Adrian watched her closely, not because he expected resistance, but because he expected something, anything that would confirm she understood the weight of what she had just done. But she gave him nothing. Just calm. Just silence. And that silence meant more than anything else. The house she moved into was exactly what power looked like when it stripped away everything human. Large, flawless, perfectly designed, but empty in a way that didn't feel accidental. Every room had purpose, every detail had intention, but there was no warmth, no personality, no history. It wasn't a home. It was structure. It was control. Lila walked through it slowly, her heels making soft sounds against the floor, her eyes taking in everything without reacting. She didn't look impressed, didn't ask questions, didn't show curiosity the way most people would. She observed. That was what she always did first. Observe, understand, then act. Adrian noticed that too, though he didn't fully process what it meant yet. "You'll have everything you need," he said as he walked ahead of her, speaking like a man who had given this explanation many times before. "Staff, security, access to accounts. You won't have to worry about anything." The word anything lingered in her mind, not because it sounded reassuring, but because it sounded like control disguised as comfort. "And in return?" she asked calmly, stopping just enough to make him turn back toward her. He looked at her for a moment before answering, measuring his words even though the answer was simple. "You play your role." There was again that structure, that expectation. "And what role is that?" she asked, even though she already knew. "My wife," he replied without hesitation. The words still didn't carry emotion, still didn't feel real. Just another label, another requirement. "Public appearances, events, interviews when necessary. You behave appropriately. You don't create problems." He paused slightly before adding, "And you don't interfere." That last part was the real rule, the one that mattered more than anything else. "Interfere with what?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. "My business," he said. That was the boundary. The line he believed she wouldn't cross. Lila nodded slowly, as if accepting it without question. "I understand," she said. And Adrian believed her. That belief would become one of his biggest mistakes. The first few days passed quietly, almost too smoothly. Lila adapted quickly, faster than expected. She learned the routines of the house, the patterns of the staff, the rhythm of Adrian's schedule. She spoke when necessary, stayed silent when it was expected, and moved through the environment like she had always belonged there. To Adrian it looked like compliance, like adjustment, like control working exactly as intended. But that wasn't what was actually happening. Because while he saw someone settling into the role he created, what was really happening was something far more calculated. Lila was watching everything. Not casually, not out of curiosity, but with intention. She noticed how often Adrian took calls in private, how certain names changed his tone, how some meetings lasted longer than others, how certain topics made him end conversations abruptly. She paid attention to timing, to patterns, to details that most people would overlook. And slowly, piece by piece, she began to see something important. No empire is without gaps. And Adrian Wolf's world, no matter how controlled it looked, had cracks. One evening, when the house was quiet and the staff had retreated into their routines, Lila walked down the hallway toward his office. Not by accident. Not out of curiosity. She knew exactly what she was doing. The door wasn't fully closed, just slightly open, enough to reveal a faint light inside. She paused for a second, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the weight of the decision. This was a line. Lila moved closer, her movements calm, her breathing steady. There was no rush, no panic, no hesitation in the way she approached the desk. Because this wasn't about impulse. This was about timing. She looked at the screen. Emails, financial data, internal documents. Layers of information, all structured, all protected. And then something caught her attention. File. Encrypted, but partially visible. She didn't open the file. Not yet. That was important. Because rushing would mean reacting. And Lila didn't react. She calculated. She stepped back slightly, her expression returning to neutral, her thoughts already moving ahead of the moment. This wasn't about one discovery. This was about understanding the system behind it. And systems take time to break. As she turned to leave the office, something else became clear. Adrian Wolf had built something powerful, something controlled, something designed to prevent exactly this kind of intrusion. But control creates patterns. And patterns can be studied. And studied patterns can be used. What she didn't know yet was that Adrian had started noticing something too. Not the details, not the actions, but the shift. The way she moved. The way she responded. The way she seemed just a little too calm, a little too aware. It wasn't enough to alarm him, But it was enough to make him look twice. And that was where everything began to change. Because curiosity, even in someone like Adrian Wolfe, creates space. And space is where control begins to weaken. What happened next would not just test the structure he built. It would begin to unravel it. The shift didn't happen all at once. It started small, almost invisible, the kind of change that doesn't raise alarms until it's already too late. Adrian Wolfe's world was built on precision, on systems that operated exactly as designed, on decisions that were calculated down to the smallest detail. But even the most controlled systems rely on one thing: assumption. And Adrian's biggest assumption was that Lila didn't understand his world, that she didn't belong in it, that she couldn't navigate it. That assumption became his blind spot. It started during a meeting, a normal one. Investors, numbers, projections, the kind of environment Adrian thrived in. Lila was there, not because he wanted her involved, but because her presence supported the image he needed to maintain. A stable marriage. Controlled narrative. She sat quietly, just as expected, listening without interrupting, observing without reacting. To everyone else, she looked like exactly what she appeared to be. A woman placed into a world she didn't fully understand. But that wasn't what was happening. Because as the conversation unfolded, as numbers were discussed and decisions were outlined, Lila heard something. Name. The same name she had seen in that file. Her expression didn't change. Her posture remained steady. But inside everything aligned. Because now it wasn't just a fragment. It was a connection. Pattern forming. And once a pattern begins to form, it can be completed. That night she returned to the office. This time there was no hesitation. No pause at the door. She stepped inside with clarity, with purpose. The laptop was there again. This time she accessed it fully. No distraction. No delay. When she opened the file, everything slowed down. Not because she was overwhelmed, but because she understood the importance of what she was about to see. The information inside wasn't random. It wasn't just business. It was structure, hidden transactions, layered accounts, connections that weren't meant to be obvious. And as she read through it, her reaction wasn't shock. It was recognition. Because this wasn't unfamiliar territory. This was something she understood. Something she had seen before. Something that connected directly to her past in a way Adrian could never have predicted. That was the truth he didn't know. Lila Monroe was never just a waitress. That identity was real, but it wasn't complete. There were layers beneath it. Experience, knowledge, awareness. And now, all of that was being activated. From that moment, everything she did became intentional. Subtle changes, small adjustments, access used carefully. She didn't move fast. She moved precisely. Contracts were reviewed. Decisions were influenced quietly. Information was redirected. Nothing obvious. Nothing immediate. But over time the effects started to show. Deals slowed down. Internal disagreements increased. Questions started appearing where there had once been certainty. And Adrian began to notice. First it was just irritation. Small disruptions. Minor inconsistencies. But then it grew. By the time he confronted her, the shift was already deep. "You've been in my office," he said. His tone controlled but sharper than before. Lila didn't deny it. "Yes," she replied calmly. No hesitation. No fear. That alone unsettled him. "You crossed a line," he said. And for a brief moment, there was silence between them. Then she responded. "You created one." That answer changed everything. Because it reframed the entire situation. It wasn't just about boundaries anymore. It was about who defined them. "You don't understand what you're doing," Adrian said. But there was something different in his voice now. Not just control. Something else. Uncertainty. And that was the moment Lila smiled. Not subtly. Not hidden. Fully. Clearly. Confidently. "I understand perfectly," she said. That was when it hit him. Not all at once, but enough to matter. The realization that something had shifted beyond his control. That the woman he thought he had placed into his world, shaped into his system, was not operating within it the way he expected. That she wasn't reacting. She was acting. Strategically. Intentionally. And for the first time, Adrian Wolfe wasn't in full control of the situation. But by then, it was already too late. Because everything he built was already in motion against him. And in that moment, everything changed forever. The collapse didn't happen in one moment. Never does. Empires like Adrian Wolfe's don't fall with noise at the beginning. They weaken quietly from the inside, in ways no one notices until the damage is already done. Adrian saw it, of course he did, but he treated it like every other problem he had ever faced, something to be analyzed, controlled, corrected. It wasn't market shifts. It was inside his own system. And that was the one place he had never learned to defend against. Lila didn't rush anything. That was the difference between destruction and collapse. Destruction is loud. Collapse is quiet. She moved carefully, precisely, adjusting things in ways that couldn't be traced back to her easily. Information was redirected at just the right moments. Small approvals were delayed. Certain decisions were influenced subtly through people who believed they were acting on their own judgment. She didn't break the system. She let the system break itself. And Adrian, for all his intelligence, for all his control, couldn't immediately see it. Because what he was looking for was force. What she was using was patience. By the time the board started asking questions, the cracks were already visible. Investors weren't as confident as before. Numbers that once moved smoothly now showed inconsistencies. Projects that were supposed to be secure began to feel unstable. Adrian stood in the middle of it all, still trying to hold everything together, still trying to maintain control, but something had shifted in a way he couldn't reverse quickly. And the more he pushed to fix it, the more resistance he encountered. It didn't make sense to him. It didn't follow the logic he understood. And that was because this wasn't just business anymore. This was strategy layered with something deeper. She still played her role. She still appeared in public as his wife, calm, composed, supportive when necessary. No one questioned her. No one suspected her. Because to everyone else, she was still just the woman he had married to maintain his image. That assumption protected her more than anything else. But Adrian had started to see it. Not the full picture, not yet, but enough to feel it. Enough to know that something about her wasn't what he had believed at the beginning. The calmness that once looked like compliance now felt like control. The silence that once seemed passive now felt intentional. And the way she moved through his world, through his space, through his life, no longer looked like someone adapting. It looked like someone who had always known how to be there. The realization came slowly. But when it came, it hit harder than anything else. He hadn't brought her into his world. She had walked into it on her own terms. The confrontation happened late at night. Not planned. Not structured. Just inevitable. Adrian stood in his office, the same place where everything had started to unravel, the same place where she had first crossed into his system. And when Lila walked in, there was no tension in her movement, no hesitation, no uncertainty. Just calm. Just control. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking, as if trying to find the right words, or maybe trying to understand how things had reached this point. "What are you?" he asked finally. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even accusation. It was something closer to realization. Lila didn't answer immediately. She walked a little further into the room, her eyes steady on him, her expression unchanged. "Someone you underestimated," she said quietly. That answer carried more weight than anything else she could have said. 'Cause it was simple. And it was true. Adrian let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair in a rare moment of visible frustration. "This was never about the marriage," he said, more to himself than to her. "No," she replied. "It wasn't." And that was the moment the final piece clicked into place for him. "You knew," he said, his voice lower now, sharper. "From the beginning." Lila held his gaze without flinching. "Not everything," she said. "But enough." There was silence after that, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything that had led to this point. Every decision, every moment, every shift in power. Adrian looked at her differently now, not as someone beneath him, not as someone he controlled, but as someone who had matched him in a way he never expected. And maybe that was the most dangerous part of all. Why? He asked finally. It wasn't a strategic question. It was personal. And for the first time, there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Lila's expression softened slightly, but not with weakness, not with regret, just with clarity. Because people like you believe power means control, she said. And people like me know power means patience. She paused for a second, letting that settle before continuing. You built everything thinking no one could reach you. You never considered that someone would walk in and learn it from the inside. Adrian didn't respond immediately. He couldn't. Because for the first time, he wasn't ahead of the situation. He wasn't controlling the outcome. He was inside something he didn't fully understand. And that was a position he had never been in before. You destroyed everything, he said quietly. Lila shook her head slightly. No, she replied. I revealed it. That distinction mattered. Because it meant the weakness had always been there. She had just exposed it. The final collapse came shortly after that. Publicly, it looked like a series of unfortunate events. Financial instability, internal disagreements, strategic miscalculations. But behind all of it was a pattern that no one fully saw except the two of them. Adrian lost control piece by piece. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, in a way that made it impossible to recover quickly. And when it was over, when the empire he had built was no longer what it once was, the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. She didn't try to rebuild what had fallen. She simply walked away. Composed. Untouched. Because for her, this was never about replacing him. It was about proving something. Something deeper than revenge. Something more controlled than anger. Adrian watched her leave, standing in the same space where he had once believed he controlled everything, and for the first time, he understood what it meant to lose without a fight. Not because he didn't try, but because the fight had already been decided before he realized it had started. The woman he thought he had forced into his life had never been powerless. She had just been patient. Sometimes the most dangerous people aren't the ones who fight loudly. They're the ones who wait. The ones who watch. The ones who move when everything is already in place. 'Cause sometimes, one decision changes everything. What would you have done?